There's a version of you that walks into rooms and changes them slightly before you've said a single word. Conversations shift in tone. People sit up a little straighter without consciously deciding to. Someone who was about to say something reckless suddenly reconsiders mid-sentence, without knowing exactly why the words stopped forming the way they intended. You have likely never noticed any of this happening, because the people experiencing it rarely tell you directly, and most of them couldn't articulate it even if you asked. They simply adjust, quietly, and go on with their day as though nothing occurred at all, filing the shift away as ordinary rather than as a reaction to you specifically. Machiavelli understood something about presence that most people never bother to examine closely, because they assume presence is either loud and obvious or simply absent, with nothing meaningful existing in between those two extremes. Being feared, in the specific sense he meant it, was never about cruelty or dramatic displays of power. It was about the effect a person has on a room simply by existing in it with a certain kind of unshakable composure that other people register before they consciously understand why they're registering it. We're not talking about being scary today, and this video has nothing to do with intentionally unsettling anyone or making anyone feel small in your presence. We're talking about carrying a presence substantial enough that people manage their own behavior around you without you ever having to ask them to correct them or even acknowledge the dynamic out loud, a kind of quiet influence that operates below the level most conversations ever reach. So ask yourself honestly whether some of the following 5 signs sound uncomfortably familiar. Not because you intended any of it, but because presence like this rarely announces itself clearly to the person actually carrying it around every day. In the next few minutes, we walk through exactly how to recognize it in yourself and exactly what to do with it once you finally do. Sign 1. People go quiet or change subjects when you walk into a room, a shift so subtle it barely registers as a shift at all unless you're actively watching for it. Notice a conversation that was flowing easily suddenly clip itself short. The moment you step into the space, replaced by a slightly too casual greeting or an abrupt shift to something safer and more neutral than what was actually being discussed a second earlier, the tone visibly resetting itself around you. This happens constantly to people carrying real presence, and almost none of them clock it as anything other than coincidence, assuming the timing was simply unfortunate rather than recognizing it as an actual pattern repeating itself across different rooms and different groups of people. Machiavelli wrote extensively about how a prince's mere arrival could alter the entire tone of a court, not because anyone had been explicitly warned to behave differently, but because his presence itself carried enough weight that people recalibrated instinctively, without conscious thought or any deliberate strategy on their part, simply adjusting the way a room's temperature adjusts when a door opens. This is not about people being afraid of you in the dramatic, cinematic sense the word usually implies. It is about people sensing correctly that you notice more than most that you would register something careless said in your presence, even if you chose to say nothing about it, and that registering it might carry consequences even if you never actually voiced disapproval out loud or change your expression at all. The subject change is not rejection, and it is not evidence that people dislike you. It is a kind of unconscious respect, an acknowledgement that whatever was being said a moment ago wasn't quite ready for an audience with the kind of attention you seem to bring into any room you occupy, intentionally or not. A team that was casually complaining about a project moments earlier might suddenly pivot to discussing lunch plans the second you walk in, not because anyone did anything wrong, but because complaint feels riskier delivered in front of someone whose read on the situation seems to actually matter. Sign 2. People over-explain themselves to you without being asked, offering a paragraph of justification where a single sentence, or nothing at all, would have been entirely sufficient. Pay attention to how often people around you volunteer justifications for decisions you never questioned in the first place, filling silence with explanations nobody requested, as though an accusation had been made when none actually was, when you may not have even noticed the decision occurred. This happens specifically around people whose judgment is quietly assumed to be sharp enough to notice inconsistencies, sharp enough that a person feels an unconscious need to preempt any doubt before it can even form in your mind. Machiavelli's advisors often over-explained themselves to him for exactly this reason. Not because he had ever demanded it or even hinted that he expected justification, but because his evident capacity for evaluation made silence feel riskier than explanation, even when no explanation was actually being sought or required in the first place. If you notice colleagues, friends, or family members frequently justifying choices you had no opinion on whatsoever, choices you may not have even registered as decisions worth commenting on, this is rarely about you being demanding or critical. It is about people crediting you, correctly or not, with a level of scrutiny they feel compelled to answer to preemptively, filling the gap before you can even ask a question you never intended to ask in the first place, defending ground nobody was actually threatening to take. A coworker might explain, unprompted and at length, exactly why they left 30 minutes early on a Tuesday, even though you never noticed the time and had no opinion on matter whatsoever, simply because your presence has quietly become the internal reference point against which their own choices get measured. Sign 3. People rarely disagree with you directly, and when they do, it comes carefully hedged, softened until the actual objection is almost buried inside the delivery meant to cushion it. Watch for how disagreement gets delivered around you specifically, compared to how it gets delivered among people who consider each other closer to equals and standing within the same group. A noticeably different register depending entirely on who's in the room. Direct, blunt pushback tends to soften considerably in your presence, arriving instead wrapped in qualifiers, framed as a question rather than a flat statement, cushioned by phrases that dilute the actual disagreement being expressed until it barely registers as disagreement at all. Machiavelli observed this dynamic constantly among courtiers who would fiercely debate each other privately, sometimes to the point of open hostility, but suddenly moderate their tone the moment a genuinely respected figure entered the conversation, adjusting not out of fear of punishment necessarily, but out of an instinctive calculation that a direct challenge carried more weight and therefore more risk than it would with someone perceived as having less actual influence over eventual outcomes. This softened disagreement is not dishonesty on the part of the person doing it. It is a kind of unconscious cost-benefit calculation happening in real time, one that only occurs around people whose opinion is quietly weighted more heavily than the room's average, whether or not that weighting was ever earned deliberately. Someone might argue passionately with a peer over a decision, raising their voice slightly, conceding nothing easily, and then present the exact same disagreement to you moments later as a gently phrased suggestion, softened almost beyond recognition, without ever consciously deciding to change their approach between the two conversations. Sign 4. People watch your reaction before committing to their own, a small but consistent tell that most people never consciously register themselves while doing it. Notice how often, in a group setting, a glance flickers toward you specifically right after something ambiguous gets said, a small pause where people seem to be checking your face before deciding how to respond themselves, even when the comment in question had nothing to do with you directly and no reasonable person would expect you to have an opinion on it at all. This is one of the clearest and most consistent signs of unrecognized presence, because it happens almost entirely outside conscious awareness on both sides of the exchange, neither party fully registering what's actually occurring in real time. Machiavelli understood that in any court, certain figures functioned as unofficial barometers, and everyone else, without any explicit agreement to do so, calibrated their own reactions partially around that figure's visible response before fully forming their own opinion on whatever had just been said or proposed. If a joke lands, and people seem to check your expression before laughing freely, waiting a beat longer than they would otherwise, if a proposal gets raised and eyes drift toward you before opinions solidify around the room, you're functioning as exactly this kind of barometer, whether you ever asked for the role or even wanted it in the first place, and whether or not you've ever once weighed in explicitly. In a meeting, an idea can sit in ambiguous territory, neither clearly good nor clearly bad, until your face registers even a flicker of reaction, at which point the entire room's assessment of the idea shifts to match what they believe they just saw, often more decisively than the idea itself actually warranted. Sign 5. People apologize to you for things that clearly did not require an apology at all. A reflex that reveals more about how they've calibrated their own standing relative to yours than about the actual size of whatever they're apologizing for. Listen for the small, almost reflexive apologies that surface around you specifically for minor lateness, for a brief interruption, for an opinion stated slightly too directly, things that would pass without comment entirely in most other interactions with other people who don't carry the same perceived weight. This pattern reveals something specific about how your presence is being unconsciously processed by the people around you, filtered through an assumption about how seriously you take small missteps that may have nothing to do with how you actually feel about them. Machiavelli noted that even minor missteps in the presence of a genuinely commanding figure tended to be overcorrected immediately, apologized for reflexively, and sometimes repeatedly, not because the misstep itself mattered in any real sense, but because the person committing it had, somewhere below conscious thought, assigned your reaction a weight disproportionate to the actual size of the infraction being apologized for. If you find yourself regularly receiving apologies for things you never would have thought twice about, things you may have already forgotten by the time the apology arrives, this is not evidence that you're difficult to be around or unreasonably demanding. It is evidence that your presence has been quietly assigned a kind of authority you may never have consciously claimed for yourself, carried by others as a working assumption about who you are. Someone arriving 4 minutes late to meet you might apologize twice, unprompted, for a delay that would have gone entirely unmentioned meeting anyone else, simply because the internal cost of disappointing you, however slight the actual disappointment might be, has been calculated as higher than the cost of disappointing most other people in their life. Before we bring this together, it's worth naming what to actually do once you recognize these signs in your own life, because awareness alone tends to just sit there uncomfortably without a practical next step attached to it. The first move is not to apologize for the effect or perform smallness to compensate for it, which usually reads as inconsistent and confuses people further rather than putting them at ease. The second move is to become deliberate about softening it specifically in moments where warmth actually matters more than authority, offering the first opinion yourself, sometimes instead of waiting to be read, laughing first instead of always being checked for permission to laugh, admitting uncertainty out loud, occasionally instead of letting silence be interpreted as evaluation. Machiavelli's own advice to princes carried a similar practical edge. Presence that goes entirely unmanaged tends to create exactly the kind of distance nobody actually wants, while presence that gets deliberately calibrated, turned up in moments that call for authority, and turned down in moments that call for connection, becomes something considerably more useful than an accident happening to you in every room you enter. Put these 5 signs together, and a pattern becomes clear that has nothing to do with intentional intimidation and everything to do with unclaimed presence sitting quietly unrecognized. People go quiet because your attention feels evaluative even when it isn't meant that way at all, even when you were barely paying attention to the conversation in question. People over-explain because your judgment is assumed to be sharp, precise, and capable of catching inconsistency in ways that feel worth preempting. People soften disagreement because your opinion is unconsciously weighted more heavily than the room's baseline, regardless of whether you've ever explicitly asked for that weighting. People check your reaction because you have become an involuntary barometer for the room, a role assigned to you without a formal vote or announcement of any kind. People apologize reflexively because your response has been assigned more significance than the situation actually warrants, filtered through an assumption about your standards that may not even match how you actually feel. None of this means you are doing anything wrong, and none of it requires you to shrink yourself or perform smallness just to make everyone else more comfortable in any given moment. Machiavelli's actual insight was never that intimidation should be weaponized carelessly against people who don't deserve it or haven't earned that treatment. It was that this kind of presence, once recognized clearly and examined honestly, becomes something that can be wielded with intention rather than leaking out unconsciously in ways that occasionally create distance you never actually wanted to create between yourself and the people around you. A person who understands they carry this effect can choose deliberately when to soften it with warmth and when to let it stand fully in moments that call for authority, rather than being unconsciously governed by an effect they never fully understood they were producing in the first place. Everything covered today comes down to a single realization worth sitting with long after this video ends. The effect you have on rooms is not always visible to you, precisely because you're inside your own experience while everyone else is reacting to the version of you they actually perceive from the outside, a version that often carries more weight and more presence than you personally feel it does from where you're standing, looking outward rather than being looked at. Recognizing these 5 signs is not about becoming self-conscious or apologizing for your own presence, second-guessing every interaction from now on as though something needs correcting. It is about understanding the actual dynamic clearly enough to use it with intention, softening it deliberately in moments that call for warmth and connection with the people who matter most to you, and letting it stand fully in moments that call for authority and decisiveness, rather than being unconsciously governed by an effect you never fully understood you were producing on the people around you every single day. This channel exists to keep giving you the real mechanics behind presence and power, past the shallow advice that never actually explains why certain people affect a room the way they do, without even trying, without raising their voice or asserting anything overtly. If today's video named something you recognized, do 3 things right now before you move on with your day, none of which take more than a moment, but all of which are worth doing anyway. Like this video, so more people quietly carrying this kind of presence without realizing it have a real chance to find it exactly when they need it, possibly after wondering for years why rooms react to them this way. Share it with someone you know who has always wondered why rooms shift slightly around them without an obvious reason they could ever point to or fully explain to anyone who asked. Subscribe to this channel right now, because the next video goes even deeper into exactly how the most commanding figures in history learned to wield presence deliberately instead of by accident, turning something involuntary into something usable, something chosen rather than simply endured. Drop this in the comments before you go so it stays with you. I understand the weight I carry. I choose when to soften it. This was never meant to be entertainment you watch once and forget on your way to something else. It was meant to change how you read the next room you walk into and how you understand exactly why it just shifted the moment you stepped inside it. Sometimes before you said a single word, sometimes before anyone even looked directly at you. I will see you in the next one.